I'm Ron Port from SayAnythingBlog.com. I'm here with Representative-elect, State Representative-elect, Josh Boschee, who was elected to the District 44, to represent District 44 in the North Dakota State House of Representatives. Won a split ticket there. The other incumbent Republican Blair Thorson was elected. Josh, of course, is a member of the Democrat Party, and also is the first openly gay member of the North Dakota State Legislature. Josh, thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, first of all, about your campaign. What was it like campaigning as an openly gay candidate for office in North Dakota?
Well, I think for the most part, it's no different than anyone else that's campaigning for office. You're running on issues that are important to the most people within your district or the electorate. And, for the most part, when out campaigning in the general public, my sexual orientation wasn't a topic of discussion. It wasn't anything asked of me or anything that I necessarily brought up. But, of course, there were community events throughout the year that, whether it was the Fargo-Moorhead Pride Festival and other LGBT-related events where, it became an issue. And so those times it was appropriate to talk about, being an openly gay candidate for office and the potential for having someone with, different experience in the House of Representatives.
It's interesting to me that you talked about how it came up during your campaign, and you seem to draw a distinction between, when it might be appropriate to talk about it and when it's not. That's something that's always fascinated me about, sort of the identity politics issue is, to me personally as a voter, I don't really care, what race or ethnic background a person has or their sexual orientation or their gender. I mean, what I really care about is policy and how they're going to vote. Do you think, being the quote unquote, first gay member of the legislature, does it bother you at all that some people might have voted for you just for that reason alone?
I guess I wouldn't say it bothered me because I got their vote. But I would hope people are voting on the facts versus, the specific intricacies of a certain candidate. Like you said, it's the issues that are important, especially when we look at where we are in North Dakota with, our record surplus and our ability to look at the next 100 years and how we set up our finances to benefit the state. It's best that we have people out there that are going to bring perspectives that are going to, whether it's challenge the status quo or make sure we're setting ourselves up for the future, not just taking care of today.
North Dakota is a state that not so very long ago voted to ban gay marriage. Obviously, there's still a lot of feelings against homosexuality or whatever in the state. Did you encounter any hateful comments or anything related to your sexual orientation during the campaign?
Not really. On the doors, which we spent most of our time campaigning, it was only positive things I heard from people if they recognized me as the candidate, who had worked with the LGBT community. Otherwise, there was a hate group out of Virginia who started posting some online ads about 2 weeks out of the election, talking about me taking a homosexual agenda to Bismarck and what that meant. And so that included my email address that people should have emailed me to tell me to stop. And I received about 30 emails, and 29 of those were positive. People, sending me supportive, keep on going, doing what you do. And one gentleman from rural North Dakota who, didn't agree with who I was as a person and didn't understand why I'd be taking an agenda to Bismarck. So overwhelmingly, anyone interested, if the topic came up, it was positive. It wasn't negative.
Did that surprise you at all?
No, not really. I think part of that is we have our North Dakota nice. If people don't agree with me because of who I am, I think they're less likely to bring that up, in a social setting like that or a one-on-one setting, and that's fine. I think in the end, like I said, when we look at, especially our district, people voted for who they thought were the best candidates. I was the top vote getter. Blair Thorson, who's a long-serving Republican incumbent, received the second highest vote. So really an independent district that, looks at the candidate versus the party.
Do you think attitudes are changing? And I say that because in my personal view, I think that as I talk with, as a conservative, as I talk with younger conservatives, they tend to take a more libertarian view towards marriage, either saying that they don't care, or being outright supportive, or just saying they don't really care, it doesn't affect them, they're straight, and gays ought to be able to do what they want to do, or taking the position that maybe even if they feel personally that they have a moral objection to homosexuality, that government oughtn't be involved in marriage, and it's between, it's a private matter for churches and individuals to settle for themselves. I think that's an attitude shift that's coming even among Republicans. Do you think that North Dakota, as an overall socially conservative state, that there's a shift coming in terms of attitudes towards homosexuality and gay issues?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening, not just in North Dakota, but what we're seeing throughout the United States. You mentioned in 2004 we had our marriage amendment that defined marriage as one man and one woman, and that was overwhelmingly voted in support. 8 years later, we find that 4 different ballot initiatives worked in favor of same-sex marriage throughout the United States. We elected a president who came out in favor of marriage equality, and it didn't damage his campaign any more than what they projected. So I think there's a shift, and especially when we're talking about conservative people, especially a younger demographic of conservatives. You're right on. It's a non-issue to them. They want to focus on the economy and jobs and keeping the government, limiting government out of personal lives, and marriage falls within that. With many of the young conservatives I talk to and friends with.
Yeah, that's certainly a position I take, is that the limited government position would be for the government not to define marriage. But before we digress into my personal views on the issue, what sort are as a elected member of the House of Representatives, we're going to be going into the next session here. What sort of legislation are you looking to tackle in terms of homosexual issues in the state of North Dakota?
Well, really the only thing that I have on my radar is reintroducing what we introduced in 2009 in the legislative session to amend the North Dakota Human Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes. I know that we still have people in North Dakota who are being fired or removed from their apartments because they're either perceived to be or actually found out to be gay. And I don't think that's right. I think especially in a state where we take care of our neighbors, things like that shouldn't matter, and we want everyone to be successful members of our community, so people shouldn't be fearful of their job or where they live because of who they are. So I'd like to rectify that and reintroduce that. We've already had some conversations with legislators on both sides of the aisle to see about how we move that forward this session.
What about other issues? Getting away from the homosexuality issues, like fiscal issues. Obviously, tax relief is a real bear. A lot of opposing views about what's going on. We had a property tax measure that, while it failed on the June ballot, I think just the fact that it was present on the ballot speaks to a lot of dissatisfaction yet with where we're at on property taxes. And of course, the state has huge budget surpluses and things like that. And a lot of North Dakotans are wondering, what can we do about taxes and maybe even lower tax burdens? What are your views on that going into the session?
Well, you're right. I mean, that was the main conversation of the campaign. Overwhelmingly, people I talked to in our district, did not support Measure 2, but they want something done with the property taxes. And so I think, we as a legislature need to wake up and say that people are paying attention to this issue and they want something done. And there's a variety of different perspectives out there. And I definitely at this point am taking the viewpoint of what can we do that's going to be sustainable. So is that setting aside a certain amount of money that will continue to produce revenue that will offset property taxes 10, 20, 50 years from now, instead of it being a short-term fix. And 10 years from now, if we have a bust, we have to come back and increase property taxes. I think there's also things we can look at as far as different funding models in regards to education, whether it's at the local level or the university system, and how we use that money today for long-term sustainability.
You talk about the university system. We've seen a pretty dramatic increase in spending on higher education in North Dakota going back to the 2003-2005 biennium. I think it's something along the lines of a 70% increase in total spending on the university system from the state, over a 17% increase in enrollment, a lot more money going in for not quite the same level of growth in enrollment. Do you think we've gotten to a point where we have a problem with higher ed spending? And certainly we've seen some problems with oversight in the university system. What happened at Dickinson State is one example, some controversies over the way money is spent at some of the universities. higher education, both nationally, is a real problem, and in North Dakota, at least in my view, is a problem as well. Do you think it might be time to prioritize some of the spending that higher education does?
Well, I think to begin with, when we look at that, that what we would see is a dramatic increase in spending in higher education, we also have to remember that North Dakota for a long time was underfunding higher education. So we had an opportunity to do some catch-up, and I think the legislature has done a great job of that. I think looking once again long-term, we really need to look at what are our priorities as far as meeting certain outcomes. Dr. Shivani has put out his plan for what we should do with the university system, and that includes different funding models. I like the idea of splitting up our research institutions compared to our 4-year and our 2-year institutions and comparing apples to apples. But I think they should be much more outcome-based. An institution should be rewarded based on what they're producing as a product. So if that's increasing retention, if that's increasing matriculation from entry level to graduation, we really need to look at those numbers, because each campus is going to do it differently, and they're going to have unique ways of doing that.
Yeah, because if you look at some of those outcome numbers, they're not very good. I mean, even going out to like 6-year graduation rates for NDSU and UND, you've got less than half of students graduating. If you look at a 2-year school, Williston, some of their cohorts, are not in a 150% graduation rate. A 3-year graduation rate at a 2-year school, they're graduating less than a third of students. So it seems to be outcomes seem to be a real problem in the university system. Right.
And, the tricky thing with those numbers are we right now only track students from the institution they start at. So we're not even tracking, of those 47%, if we're looking at one institution of a 6-year graduation rate, we're not looking at students who transferred to another university system institution. So we need to do a better job, and Dr. Shivani addresses that, which is great, that we track our students all the way through. So the numbers can be kind of deceiving, but we do know we do need to increase our retention and our graduation rates, regardless of what those numbers are. I believe some of those numbers put us at just below the national average, or right at, with where we're at as a state and the innovation that's happening at our different institutions. There's no reason why we're not above that national average.
Anything else? Last question. Anything else that we haven't covered in terms of what your priorities are as a new member of the North Dakota Legislature?
One thing we didn't talk about is I definitely would like to see us invest a little bit more into early childhood education. We talked especially to the Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development Corporation here in the Fargo-Moorhead area. They recognize that when we invest in early childhood education, it pays off in the long run as far as our students being better prepared in K through 12 and then on to higher education. So I think there's some things that we can do innovatively to, once again, develop a long-term strategy for those type of programs, and I'd like to see that.
All right, Josh, thank you very much for your time.